everybody. Welcome. Today we have Ron with us for our special Tuesday stream where he's going to be talking about some cool stuff around platform engineering, serverless templating. So Ron is a principal software architect at CyberArk, serverless hero. Yes. Yes, you are, right? If you're muted right now, but if you've been learning serverless cloud or anything, you probably run into a video, podcast, uh, or any blog post that Ron has built or written for us. So he's got a lot of stuff out there. Welcome, Ron.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me.
Happy to have
So,
you and talking about
I
interesting stuff.
yeah, I actually changed the title of the original of the presentation. I hope that's okay. I think it's
It's
more fitting.
perfectly fine. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
perfectly fine. So yeah, it's mastering serverless right now.
mastering so yeah.
It's something we all try to do every day. So hopefully this takes us one step further. So
Hopefully,
I'll let
hopefully.
you run your presentation now. I'll pull your slides in and I'll pop out.
Okay. So just let me know when I can start. Okay. So, mastering serverless platform engineering blueprints for success. So, hi everybody. Today we're going to discuss how we can accelerate the adoption and creation of serverless services in your organization using blueprints. I'm going to share our journey at CyberArk at the platform engineering group over the last years. I'm going to share the blueprints, insights, and I'm going to show you how we did it. So, some context. I work at CyberArk, which is a cybersecurity company. We've been around for 25 years, which is quite cool. So yeah, this year it's the 25th year. We have over 3,000 employees and 1,000 developers across the globe. And back in the day, we started our journey in the privileged access management domain with on-premise solutions. And we've broadened our scope to the identity security domain. And in the last several years, we've started to become a SaaS provider, and we're advocating for a serverless first mindset. And this is basically where our talk is going to start, being a serverless first SaaS provider. So I want to tell you a story. Let's take about 4 or 5 years ago. We were a SaaS provider. We had a couple of services, but they were each service was its own thing, its own technological stack. And for the customer side, it was a very different user experience. There was nothing really connecting between the services. So it's not like you had one platform, one unified experience for the customer, which was not great. The developers, they had different technological stacks. And the SREs, they also had different observability stacks. So it was very hard for them to maintain and support all the services. So CyberArk decided about 4 or 5 years ago that it wants to become a bigger and larger SaaS provider, have more services, but we wanted to do it right. So we wanted to provide a unified platform, basically a unified experience for the services, for the customers, a unified experience for the developers. So we're going to use the same technology, and a unified observability stack so the SREs will have an easier life. And for that purpose, we started the platform engineering group, which I joined right at the beginning. We were about 10 people, and we're tasked with basically building this unified experience and advocating and pushing the serverless adoption at CyberArk. And it basically means to do whatever in our power, whether it's to build services, so they provide the unified experience behind the scenes for the services at CyberArk, whether it's building SDKs, whether it's defining the best practices, basically doing whatever I can do to help the company build serverless services and have a unified experience. So we were told to basically use AWS and use serverless. And I had no idea. I didn't know anything about serverless. I was a Kubernetes guy, really liked it. I had no idea about the cloud. And we started to build our new serverless service. We started with the tenant management service, the customer onboarding service, and very quickly we realized that serverless is a very amazing technology. It can do very amazing things very quickly, but it raised lots of questions, and we really understood that it's very different from what we're used to do. And it is different. It starts from the design stage. So in the design stage, it's like building a Lego. You have an API gateway. You connect it to the Lambda function that you write. And then you add DynamoDB table, DynamoDB streams, SNS, SQS. You connect everything together. Some parts you write the code for, so the other you just write the configuration, and AWS manages them for you, which is very different than just writing containers with APIs and communicating between them. It's very different. It's also different in the infrastructure as code aspect. So we don't have a DevOps engineer that is going to do the Helm charts, right? He's not going to start a new service for us. Everybody does DevOps. If you want to have a new Lambda function, a new SQS queue, the developer is going to write it. They're going to add the CDK. We use CDK. They're going to write a new CDK line, and they're going to add this new queue and deploy it. They own it from the dev stages all the way to production, which is very different than what we're used to do. And then when we started to write Lambda function, we realized that we don't really know how to write it. What's the best way to write a Lambda function? Is there really a best way to write it? Do you write everything in the handler? Do you use classes, interfaces, hexagonal architecture, layers, things like that? Back in the day, 5 years ago, there wasn't a lot of documentation, and information was harder to find. So we needed to figure that out for ourselves. Then came observability. How do we understand how to track a customer request that goes between services, from API gateway to my Lambda function to another service to an SNS and SQS? How do I track everything? How do I understand what is going on in the system? We also need to figure that out. Testing. How do we test Lambda functions? How do we test our serverless services? Do we spin up a container locally to mimic a Lambda environment? Do we do it locally? Do we test everything in the console on end-to-end environment? Again, we need to figure out how to do that. And lastly, as we approach production, we need to figure out security. So AWS figures out the security for you of the cloud, but for every resource that you define and configure, you need to make sure that it is secure. So again, we need to understand, what does it mean to have a secure serverless service? Which aspects do we need to have? Encrypted trust, SNS, SQS, things like that. We didn't really understand at the beginning. And then you have FinOps. Serverless can cost you a lot of money if you don't pay attention. Again, we need to understand where we can save money and how we can do it. And at some point, we came to a conclusion that we have our first service. It's kind of stable. We understand what we're doing. We know how to develop it. We gain more speed doing that. And we realized, okay, we have one service, but we have so many other services to go. We need to build a platform. We need to build so many services that the company depends on: authentication, authorization, audit service, so many services. But we have a new challenge. We want to recruit more people, and the company also wants other services to go to the serverless route and start basically connecting and integrating with this new platform. So now comes the question: how do we do that? How do we keep the standards and all the best practices that we've learned and understood until this point? How do we use the same tools for observability, the same tools for observability, the same layers of observability, and how do we do that quickly? So our solution is to basically build a blueprint, or a template, if you like, but blueprint is a nicer name. And that's what we did. And until this point, it's been used by hundreds of developers, and we've created dozens of microservices, I think over 100 of repositories, and I'd estimate that we've saved years of development. Seriously, years. So hopefully that now you realize that blueprints have some value, at least from our experience. And that's what we're going to discuss, all sorts of aspects of blueprints. So at the beginning, we're going to discuss what is exactly a serverless blueprint. How do we define it? I'm going to use my open source blueprint. It's called the AWS Lambda Handler Cookbook. And using it, you are going to discuss what is the golden path for serverless, what needs to be inside that serverless blueprint. And then when we define the golden path, right, the best blueprint that we have, we're going to discuss how we can basically let people adopt and use it in their organization, because just because you have a good template doesn't mean that people know and want to use it. Lastly, we're going to discuss whether you can take this blueprint to production at the enterprise level, and then I'm going to give you some homework in the form of action items. So a little bit about myself, in case you've missed at the beginning. My name is Ron Eisenberg, Principal Software Architect at CyberArk at the Platform Engineering Division. Started as a group, now we're a division. I'm an AWS Service Hero for the past year or so. And I have a website, it's called roundthebiller.cloud, where I publish lots of articles, over 50 now, about serverless, AWS. I have my lectures there, so you're more than welcome to check it out. Right, so let's talk about what is a serverless blueprint. So in my idea, it's a GitHub repository, right? It's a GitHub repository that lets you start a new service, scaffolds the service name and other parameters, and then you have your new repository. But it's not just a repository. It has all sorts of tools and standards for serverless. So basically, developers don't need to reinvent the wheel and figure that out again. So this is how we can basically implement and propagate all the best practices and tools across the organization very quickly. So developers can focus on the business domain. They don't need to think about all the other things. And I like the buzzword, we reduce cognitive load. This is how we do it, basically. And of course, it needs to be reusable, very easy and very quickly. So let me introduce you to the AWS Lambda Handler Cookbook template. You have the QR code, which leads to the GitHub of the open source. It's my version of the blueprint that we did at CyberArk, but it's the open source version, so you can use it. Basically allows you to start a new serverless service. It's based on Python, CDK for the infrastructure as a code, and GitHub Actions for the CI/CD pipeline. It has over 450 GitHub stars, 200 plus clones per month, 1,000 of views. And what does it give you? Well, it gives you a good starting point, at least I hope so. Basically, you get a simple CRUD API, which is, I think that most services, they do start with some sort of a CRUD API. So I designed the orders service. You get an API gateway, the Lambda function, DynamoDB table that saves the orders of our customers. And I think the DynamoDB table, that's a great service to start with the database. It's very simple, easy to deploy. And as you will see later on, because we're going to write our code in a certain way, it should be easy to replace it down the road if the need comes to. What else do we get? We get all the tools and best practices I'm going to show you in a second. And the most important thing, it's fully deployable, and all the tests are going to work on day one. So the second you scaffold, you can deploy, run the tests, and start working. Now, there are also two other things here. There's the idempotency database and app config feature flags, which are more advanced topics, and I don't want to go into that in this session, but there's fully documentation on the GitHub repo itself. Another thing that I want to clarify is that blueprints have context. Now, while the cookbook, it basically implements global concepts of serverless, however, it's my tech stack. It's my approach, it's my implementation, it's the tools that I prefer. So first of all, some homework for you. Make it your own. Use it as an inspiration to create your own variation of this blueprint, okay? And another important thing, blueprints are a living entity, which means that, first of all, nobody creates the perfect template blueprint on the first day. It's a cycle. You start with something, People use it, you get feedback, you add things, then people use it, you get feedback, vice versa. The cookbook that we started with 4 years ago looks nothing similar to the one we have today, and that's okay. We learned things and we adopted it. So, what does this cookbook provide you in terms of golden path for serverless services? So I've divided it into several categories. First of all, it's going to be starting from very simple project folder structure and infrastructure as code essentials, the CI/CD pipeline, Lambda handler best practices, some testing, and observability. So let's start with the folder structure. So we're going to have a folder in the cookbook for the service name, and it's going to hold the business domain logic, the Lambda code, very basic. We're going to have some layers, which I'm going to discuss later on. So you have the handlers layer, the logic layer for the business domain layer, the actual code, the business logic. You have models for the input validation, like pydantic in Python. And you have the DAL or the integration. It's basically the data access layer. We're going to discuss that later on. Then you have tests, unit integration, end-to-end, pretty basic. And then you have the infrastructure as code folder. So like I said, I'm using CDK, but you can use SAM or Terraform or whatever you want to use. But the reason I've mentioned it is because it goes back to what I said at the beginning, the DevOps culture. The infrastructure as code, all the resources that we define, they sit together in the same repository, right, with the Lambda code, because they deploy it basically. So again, developer wants to add a new Lambda function, new SNS, SQS, DynamoDB, whatever. They have this folder, they edit the construct, they add a new construct, and they deploy. Everything is together. Basically, again, the DevOps culture mindset. Now, as for the infrastructure as code part, obviously it creates all the resources, but it also has very important configurations. So I've added security to the cookbook in the form of CDK NAG, which is an open source that basically before you deploy your code, CDK synthesizes the code to a CloudFormation template, and then you can run checks on the template itself to make sure that you're not deploying something that has some security risk to the cloud. So it stops you from making mistakes in production. So I've added this utility automatically to the CDK code. You're going to have some FinOps optimization, cost saving. So for instance, in dev accounts, you're going to set, maybe you have an Aurora cluster, you're going to set the machine types to something that you're not going to pay that much, but in production, you're going to have a much stronger machine. Backups, you're going to have backups enabled for your DynamoDB table or Aurora tables. Performance, you might want to have provisioned concurrency for your Lambda functions in production, but not in dev accounts. So all these configurations are very critical and are part of the infrastructure as code. Lastly, I've added stack tags, which I think are a must for every company, every serverless service. I've added tags for service. It's a CloudFormation stack tags for the service and team identifiers. And it really helps you to understand each resource, where it came from. And when you're looking at the total cost of the services, it really helps you to understand. At the cost expert, you can search by tags, and then you can see if you have multiple services or microservices sharing the same account, you can then differentiate and understand which service is costing you more money. So stack tags are very critical. And again, this is added in the service, in the template already. Now I want to talk about CI/CD pipeline. Obviously, every service needs a CI/CD pipeline, and this one is no different. And you have all the stages that you'd expect here. But the idea here is that this pipeline from day one, it just works. The developer doesn't need to figure out what it does, why. It just has all the best practices, all the tools for Python in my case, for serverless, and it works from dev stages, from the pull request to production. Very critical that this blueprint will support it from dev to production, day one, okay? So in this case, the stages are very simple. I check out the code, install dependencies, run some pre-commit hooks, check for linters, file formatters, complexity checks, the security checks, unit tests. I have some docs linting for GitHub pages. We're going to discuss that later on. And then you build and deploy your Lambda function, the zip file, to the cloud, to AWS. Run the tests, the integration tests, end-to-end code coverage, 100% code coverage at the cookbook at the moment. And lastly, which is a nice feature that I added with PowerTools, open API generation. So Swagger file for the API is added automatically and is uploaded to the GitHub pages of the service. So again, from dev to production, day one, developer doesn't need to think about it, just works. And this is how it looks in the GitHub, in the cookbook. You have the pull request, you have several steps, you have the quality standards. Once everything is up to standards, we start the deployment and run the end-to-end and integration tests. And once we merge the code, we have multiple environment support, again, out of the box, from dev to production. So we have the staging environment, which does the regular tests. And then we have production, which I decided not to do tests on production. And then lastly, once everything is merged and working, I publish the API, the Swagger file, to the GitHub pages. So I can basically let my customers know, here's the updated API, here's the documentation, go for it. Now I want to discuss Lambda function best practices. So I don't think that you should write your Lambda function, everything in the handler. That's not the best approach, usually. So I'd advocate for architectural layers. Now, the reason that any good blueprint need to have a proper defined Lambda function is because we need to set the standards for other developers to understand how do they write Lambda functions, what is expected of them at the organization level. If they want to write a new Lambda function, they need to have a good example that they can use and mimic. So here we're going to have 3 layers. We have the handler layer, which basically takes the configuration, does the input validation, and then passes the input to the domain layer, which is the business domain code. It does what it needs to do, and if it needs to interact with database or an external service, it's going to use an interface class from the DAL or integration, and that layer is the only layer that basically knows how to speak or interact with the database or external service. So it can be easily replaced in the future. So this is a very critical aspect. So developers will see this format and layers and understand how to write them themselves. And I also added to the cookbook. Again, this is all in the cookbook. You have all these examples. Also, I've added PowerTools. So if you're not familiar with PowerTools is the AWS PowerTools library for Lambda. It's an amazing open source library. It has over 4 million downloads per month. And it's basically a set of utilities of best practices, input validation, error handling, logger, tracing, metrics, SQS, batch handling, you name it, it's there. But again, it's important to show the developers, the new developers that are going to write new services, how to do it. How do you write a good code that uses all these practices and utilities? So again, you can see this example in the cookbook, in the blueprint that I wrote. Then you have organization and SDKs. And this is very interesting. At CyberArk, we're a security company. So we have several security-related SDKs, internal SDKs. For example, tenant isolation. The tenant isolation SDK is an SDK that basically lets you access the data of in a multi-tenant environment. Maybe you have a DynamoDB table that saves all the tenants' data in one table. And then the Lambda is always in the context of one tenant, and you want to access the table in a secure manner, so there's no breach of data. There's no way you're going to accidentally access another tenant's data. So we've actually built a library for that, so developers don't need to think about it. If they use the library, they're going to be safe. However, it's a bit complicated sometimes to set up, and people don't always know how to use it. So the moment that you have a working example that they can work with, debug, and mimic, they're going to use it. It's going to make it so much easier to work, and people are not going to make mistakes. And other examples are maybe authentication or authorization, whatever implementation you might have internally, that should be also in the blueprint out of the box. Testing. Serverless testing is a tricky one. There are so many versions. I've heard so many options and people doing all sorts of things. And it's okay. I mean, as long as you find something that works for you and makes sense for you. I have my approach. I think everybody has unit test, integration, and end-to-end. Maybe they call them different names. In unit test, usually everybody does. It's run locally. You don't require deployment. It runs with mocks. Integration, I use it. I run them on the IDE, access AWS resources, and mock whatever I want to fail to simulate failures for testing. And end-to-end just basically mimic the customer API calls and just run everything on the cloud. So again, it's very important for the developers to see how to write a proper test. Once they see what is expected of them, how they write the proper test, how they write the assertion, they can write new tests and add new functionalities to the Lambda function. So again, it's very critical to set the standards and have it in the blueprint. Obviously, the bigger code coverage that you have is also the better. Unified observability. If you recall the beginning, I've mentioned that we've had different observability tools for different services, which is not great. We want to have the same language that all the organization speaks. So it's easy to basically debug one customer transaction from one service to another service across multiple teams, AWS accounts, and regions. Okay, so it's going to work like this. We're going to basically use power tools at the handler level, and then we're going to add some infrastructure as code to really complete the unified observability experience. So for the SDK, we're going to use the logger for power tools, and we're going to write JSON logs for CloudWatch. We're going to use the metrics utility to write custom CloudWatch metrics for KPIs, basically for the product KPIs. And then we're going to use traces using AWS X-Ray. We're going to figure out where our bottleneck is, how we can optimize our performance. And again, this is built into the blueprint, so they have perfect observability from day one. Again, critical, everything just works. Again, for the infrastructure as code, you have dashboards. So the CDK code actually spins up a CloudWatch dashboard that basically shows you all the information, the logs, the metrics, the alarms that you can create for if some thresholds of metrics or log are reached. So everything just works out of the box when you deploy. And this is how you get the unified observability, but production grade observability, right? From day one. And once they have a good example of what is expected, how do you write the dashboard, they can add more and more resources to track because they have code examples and they know what is expected. So let me clarify that. And this is what I do at the cookbook. So out of the box, you get two dashboards. You get one high-level dashboard where you have, basically it's an executive summary of the status of the service. So you should be able to take a look and understand immediately if there's a problem or not. It's designed for the SREs, firefighters, or the product team. So you have the KPIs, latency, errors, things that pop. Okay, it should be very easy to understand if there's a problem or not. But there's also the low-level dashboard. And this low-level dashboard is aimed at the developers because they want maybe to have a deep dive to really understand what's going on in the service, to understand the DynamoDB table stats, the Lambda function stats, latency, the logs, to make some filters. These are things that SREs usually don't really look so deep, and product not at all, but it's critical to have this information. Right. So now that we've defined the golden path and we have the perfect blueprint, so to speak, how do we make our company to want to use it? How do we increase the adoption? How do we make it easier? So we're going to focus on several aspects: training, feedback, user experience, documentation, and ownership. You need to understand that your customers are the developers. Basically, these are internal customers. They need to be happy. They need to be able to understand how to use this blueprint. There are so many best practices, CIC, so many things are going on here out of the box. So we did a training course. Now it doesn't have to be like a recorded syllabus course. It can be just a simple Teams or Slack recording. And basically what you do there is you go over the basics of serverless, over the general guidelines of the tools, what are the best practices, how to use it, observability principles, things like that. But by the end of the training, they should be able to scaffold the service, the blueprint, start their own service, deploy it, and write a new Lambda function and write some tests for that new Lambda function, which basically means that they understand how to work with the blueprint. That should be the end of the workshop or the training. Now, it doesn't really end after that because people have questions. They want to know how to do things on AWS, how to do things on serverless, how to extend the blueprint. Somebody needs to have some opinion about that. So usually that's what I do. You have advocates, serverless experts who can help with the ongoing work and figure those parts out. So you should have somebody who can do that and not just tell them, well, there you go. Here are the basics. Now go figure that out. No, you should continue and help them. Again, to keep the same standards across the organization. Now, developers in general, they're a tough crowd. Nobody likes to be handed a set of utilities and best practices and be told, this is how you do it from now on. Good luck. People want to know that they're being heard, that they can influence, that there's an inclusion. So for every major feature that we do, we actually ask for feedback at the design stage. And once we implement everything, we ask for feedback on the result. Like, did we actually do what we promised to do? Because if it's not good enough, or it's not what I promised you, you're not going to use it. So it's not really great. I want you to want to use the blueprint. I want you to be able to use it. Otherwise, I'm not doing my job properly. So again, it's that same feedback loop that goes from the early stages of the session that we discussed. Now, user experience, it really matters. Now, think about a use case where a developer, developers know how to use the template, the blueprint. They created the pull request. They think they nailed it, and then the pipeline fails, and they have no idea why. It's really hard to understand. So they're gonna feel very frustrated, and for that reason, we started with a makefile, which then transformed to a CLI at CyberArk. But the cookbook does have a makefile. So for every step that we do at the pipeline, there's a command, a makefile or CLI command that it runs, and you can run that same command locally. So everything that runs there, you can run locally. Everything that failed there, you can run locally. But then we took it another step. We have the command make PR, make pull request for the win. What does it do? So basically, it fixes everything for you automatically. It runs the formatters, the linters, fixes what it can do for you automatically, deploys to the cloud, runs the tests, and if it's green, probably your code is going to run on the pipeline. Okay, so it makes it so much better for user experience. So people can have the confidence that once they push, they can go drink their coffee and they're going to be able to merge it without any problems. And lastly, there's the self-service aspect of the scaffolding of the first time that they're going to use the template. So this part also needs to be easy and simple, because people are going to do it lots of times, hundreds of times in the organization. So for example, in the cookbook, you can write cookie cutter. I use the tool in Python called cookie cutter. You can write cookie cutter, GitHub, run Eisenberg, cookie cutter serverless Python, enter, and then you need to add your new repository name, your service name, some information about yourself, enter, and then it's gonna clone the code, scaffold everything, then it's gonna start and build the virtual environment for you, install all the dependencies for you, and then all you need to do is write make deploy, and it's gonna deploy the service to the cloud, and that's it. You have a new serverless service with the new name, and it's already deployed to the cloud. It's working. So that's the user experience that I'm looking for. Now, documentation is also critical. Not everybody is going to look at the training and look at like 5 hours of training to find like a small sentence that you said somewhere. Documentation is critical. And this is the documentation that I have in the Lambda Handler Cookbook. I'm using GitHub Pages, and you have getting started page where it basically tells you what you need to install, how you install everything, how you run the pipeline, how you run CDK. All the best practices here are described. The pipeline is, all the stages are explained. So everything is here and it's easy to find. Now, lastly, this has been a major issue. Blueprints, they need to be maintained. People, now, if you're gonna leave that code for like 7 months, that blueprint is gonna rot. Things change, Python versions change, libraries break, things change. Somebody needs to own that blueprint and make sure it's always ready to work. And for us, we see all these blueprints, SDKs, and even services as open source. We're basically internal open source at CyberArk, and we own these repositories. We do regular maintenance, we do regular refactors, we make changes, and we also accept code contributions from other teams. We have some SDKs that are over 50% of the code was basically donated from other people at the company, which is amazing. But in the end, once they contribute the code, we own it. So if you make a bug fix, add a feature to the blueprint that was missing, once it's merged, we own it. And from that point, we're going to make sure it's going to stay healthy and stable. And that's also very critical to the success of the blueprints. Right, so we've discussed what makes a serverless golden path, how to build your blueprint, how to adopt it. But does it really get you one blueprint? Will it get you to production? Let's see. So this is the basic blueprint, right? You have the API gateway, Lambda, DynamoDB table. But in our cases at CyberArk, that's not enough. A service also has a front-end UI. So it's a cloud front that connects to the API. It serves static resources from a bucket. And usually that repository is written in React or TypeScript. It's very different than the Python here. So it's a different repository. It's a different blueprint. So we have two blueprints now. Does it still get me to production though? No, sadly no. Real life showed that your service is going to have integrations with other services. You might need to integrate to subscribe to a pub sub, a centralized pub sub like an SNS, or maybe you'll need to assume a role and access a protected API gateway of another service. So again, you have integrations that you need to somehow sort up. So that's another step in getting your production. So what I'm trying to say is production is complicated, and one blueprint is not going to get you there. So you need multiple blueprints. But even then, you have the use case of cross-account access and integration with other services. So even then, it's not enough. So what we did at CyberArk, which it's called Service in a Click, and it's a service that the lead architect for. I'm very excited for this service. And it's basically blueprints on steroids. So it's a self-service again, and it uses multiple blueprints. And basically, it's going to also automate this cross-account access for you. So by the end that it finishes, let's say 1 hour, 2 hours, you're going to get a production-ready Hello World service with everything: the front end, the back end, the pub sub connection, the other services that you need to integrate with, the tenant management service, whatever services that you need to connect with the platform, it's already there. It's already working, right? I think the punchline here is marked in red. We calculated by feedback that we got from people that all these things that they needed to do just to get a hello world service to a production grade, 13 weeks. So by automating everything, we saved for every new service 13 weeks of development time, which is crazy. And I'm really proud of the team for this service. Right. So now I'm going to give you some homework, some things to think about. So what should you do? Obviously, build a blueprint if you haven't guessed it already, but you should change things. Use it as an inspiration. Change the CI/CD tools. Change the infrastructure as code tool. Use a different observability tool. Don't use CloudWatch. Maybe use Datadog, Lumigo, whatever you want to use. But you can also add new blueprints. You can add other languages support, add a front-end blueprint, add your organizational SDKs. But basically, build a template. Use the cookbook as an inspiration of things that you should have and build it yourself. You should also automate the blueprint creation, the self-service, the AWS accounts creation, which is also critical in a big organization, the cross-account access. Basically, whatever you can automate that can make the new service life easy, just do it. Now, I know that I've shared so many best practices here, but very briefly, we didn't go into very detail about most of them, to be honest. But this is why I have this QR code here. So last reInvent, I had the honor of doing a breakout session, the pragmatic serverless Python developer with Heitor Lessa, who is the chief architect for PowerTools, which we've mentioned quite a lot here, and I'm using it quite a lot in the blueprint. And basically what we did is we started from the blueprint, we started a new service, and we built an asynchronous and synchronous part to it, like 2 microservices. We did it pretty production ready, like a lot of code. And then we explained all the best practices, why we did it and how, the testing, observability, how they write the handler, everything. So we covered that in that session, this QR code here. And pretty much everything that I've mentioned is also noted in my website, rondabiller.cloud. So again, check it out. So to sum it up, blueprints, they reduce cognitive load. We discussed the serverless blueprint golden path. We discussed how creating the blueprint is an iterative process. It takes time. Documentation and feedback are critical. And basically just go build it, make it your own. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, this is my handle, my website, and my LinkedIn. And that's it. Thank you.
That is incredible work, Ron. It's a lot. I was browsing the repository while you were speaking. There's so much in there. It's one of the things.
It's years in the work, yeah.
Yeah, it's what I was going to ask. Is how many years have you been cooking the cookbook, right? How many years has it been going on?
I think we can look at I think at least 3 years. I think
3 years.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of knowledge, a lot of feedback, and a lot of
Nice.
learning experiences that you have embedded in there, right?
Yeah, it is.
That's pretty cool. So there are a couple, not questions, but comments. So from Daryl, he mentions he tried the repo last year, and you've added a lot since then. So hey, you got a return
there's
customer.
open API protection, so you can't make any breaking changes. Swagger generation. Yeah.
So when you generate the open API, because you're generating the open API, right? You're doing that with Power Tools. I saw your post around that. So are you then kind of comparing the old open API with a new one and finding breaking changes? Is that kind of nice?
Yeah, I'm using another open source by Tufin, and it basically checks whatever you have in master branch and once you generate it on the pull request and make sure that there's no breaking changes.
That's pretty
simple.
Cool. Yes.
Yeah.
It's, if you know me, I'm very heavy on open API usage and Swagger, and have done a few comparisons, right, to find breaking changes. Alan built a breaking changes detector as well with open API, so that's pretty cool to protect you from failures, right? And having that out of the box is pretty incredible.
Yeah. I agree.
Then Ziad mentions the feedback loop is essential for adoption, right? If you don't take feedback and you don't apply those or consider the feedback you're getting, then you probably lose. You said developers
Yeah.
are tough. They're tough
People
people.
are gonna start basically forking or making their own variations,
Yep.
and then your job is pretty much uh, it's very useless because people are doing more work now and not less. Yeah.
And you can't support them, right? Because they're doing differently based on not your
Yeah.
not the pattern set by the platform engineering
Yeah.
team, and not based on the template.
And I think
Just like,
I think it's critical to understand it. I'm not forcing anybody to use anything. Like they can do other things. I mean, they need to tell the higher ups why they chose not to use. Sometimes they have, they're not going to use serverless at all, or not going to use Python, and they have good reason for that. But if they're going to use something completely different, then they're going to maintain it, and it's going to be on them. And if they have a security breach or problem or whatever, they're gonna be the ones to blame, right? If they're not using my tools. So
yeah, I totally get that. And again, it's not making it a mandate, right? It's like you have to use this. Again, developers are tough, and if you do that, they're probably going to do something else just because you said it that way, and not as, let me use this tool that you built to help me save 13 weeks, right? Like you mentioned, the time saving. That's incredible.
yeah.
Any chance you're open sourcing the service in a click?
Well, we'll see. I am planning to speak about it at reInvent, so we'll see if it gets. I mean, the cross-account automation part. I'd like to open source maybe part of that, and discuss it at reInvent. So we'll see if it gets selected. We'll see.
I'm rooting for you. So yeah, it's, as you mentioned as well, right? It's a lot of work that has to go into it, not just building it, but maintaining it, right? There's packages that are gonna run out of their lifetime, and there's new versions, and you have to keep all that maintainable. And just again, just quickly
we have.
browsing.
Yeah, even now we have the Pydantic 2 upgrade. That is a major version change. That's a major headache. You have Python upgrades, so you need to be like an open source. I need to support multiple versions at one time. So again, it's another challenge that you need to do. Yeah, like a real open source, to be honest, like any real open source.
The cool thing there is, for anybody consuming this template or this blueprint, and you upgrade it to Python 3.11, right? They'll see what you did. So they even have a path and an example of how to do that upgrade. I changed this, like for me, it's been Power Tools 2.0. There are slight changes, and I work in JavaScript, but there's slight changes in the imports and how you get all the tooling, but you have a PR that shows it, right? And then you can share that. Hey, if you're upgrading your Power Tools version, here's
that's
how you would do
exactly
it.
what we do. That's a really good way. We show, hey, here's a sample pull request, and we do like a session. This is how we can do it. These are guidelines, things that you need to look for, and then you have this pull request that you can take a deep dive and look. Yeah, that's a great way to do it. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I also saw you have like CodeQL, Dependabot, right? All the standard stuff that you need to keep yourself secure, updated, and all that.
Yeah, and I still keep it updated once per month. I do like regular checks and fix things. Things break. Yeah.
New vulnerabilities are found, right? So you got to keep track of those and not let. Who was posting? I think AJ Stunyenberg was posting. Hey, there's still like 40% of the packages out there have the Log4j package, the vulnerable version. Yeah, and it's the vulnerable one, right? There was the big deal a few years ago. It's like it's still running. If you don't have good practices and ways to actually move it forward, you're gonna get stuck and probably be more vulnerable.
I agree. Do we have any other comments, questions?
No questions in the comment fields. It's just me. I have a lot of questions, but I had a question around the make PR, right? You had the make file.
Yeah.
And you said you now have a make PR, which just takes care of everything. But what's involved in that?
So I actually stole that idea from Power Tools. I think
Okay.
that I've brought to CyberArk many of the practices I've learned from Hator and the team, the Power Tools, really even the GitHub pages usage, the documentation. I mean, they're top notch, super professional people, and I've learned so much from them. Basically, you run all the linters and code, all the, like I said, you have everything in the pipeline is just other make commands. So make PR is just a chain of commands. You have make depth, make build, make lint, make whatever, make format, and just all the way till make deploy and make end to end, which is the final one. So yeah, just it makes it easier to write the make PR because everything is already modular. So just add
Yeah.
them in one line. Yeah,
Cool. Yeah, and I agree. It's the Power Tools repository is something I reference a lot for GitHub workflows.
yeah,
It's pretty incredible all the things they've done there. So I do reference their stuff as well. I did
yeah.
see your documentation. It looks very similar, very clean, very
Yeah,
thorough.
because it's the same tool, just different color.
You branded it to
Yeah,
yourself.
yeah, yeah. It's the same tool. Yeah, it's a really good tool, though.
Cool. So we just have one comment from Ziad. Thanks for sharing.
No
Um,
problem. Thanks for coming.
and and I love the action items. For me, it's even when you started the presentation, I haven't looked at your blueprint because it's CDK, Python, things I don't
So
use on
you're a
my day to
SAM guy.
day. I'm Sam and
Oh,
JavaScript,
like
right?
Alan.
So yeah, well, we work together. We learn together
Yeah.
all these things.
Okay.
So we have the same kind of backbone on serverless. So yeah, even at the beginning, I was thinking, hey, I might take this and replicate it in the different IAC and
Yeah.
runtime. So definitely something I'll add to my
To
things I
do
want to
list.
try, things I want to do.
Cool.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Well, I really appreciate your time and giving this presentation to the community. I think it's super valuable for everybody.
I hope so. I really enjoyed it. It's really great fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks again. Yeah.
Yeah. And for everybody here watching the recording, hopefully this week we'll have um, Elad Ben Israel, CEO of Wing, talking about exploring the possibilities of combining infra and code with Wing. So we'll have him on Thursday, May 23rd at 10 a.m. Pacific, 17 UTC. So hopefully people can join us. You too, Ron.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that he's awesome. It's gonna be a good one.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks, Ron. Everybody have
Thanks.
a good day.
Bye.